All right. We are back here on Off the Record. If you want to do a little introduction, like name and instrument.
Yeah. Uh, my name is Michael Gallope, and I am here. This is my solo project, which I only started, let's say, I don't know, 3 years ago. And it's been a process of trial and error. It's like making a sauce that you work on for 3 years, and you keep coming back and kind of changing the flavors and trying different things.
Sweet. So if you have a name for the song that we just heard.
Yeah, I've just been calling it this tidal region, which is sort of the kind of what comes into my head when I play is often this space where these sort of it's an inhuman landscape where some sort of thing appears and
Yeah.
it's not it's like maybe talking to you, but maybe it's just there. And it's a kind of it's kind of an alien feeling.
Yeah.
And so I just started calling it region because I wanted it to signal that there's some sort of emptiness, there's something happening, but it's not really clear what's going on.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, that's jumping to one of the last things I was going to talk about, but I was going to ask you if you have, if any, like subject matters that you feel like drive this project, or if they sort of come after the fact. Like, I know it's sort of a meditation on certain sounds, but if there's any subjects that you feel like come to mind before you kind of lay the groundwork for the sound.
I think it's interesting you say the word subject. It's sort of like it's kind of a metaphysics in the way, because it's sort of, for me, if I'm going to sit down and ask people to kind of share some time with me musically, I want to try to transform that space to give a sense that we're going somewhere or we've forgotten where we are. And so it's not as if, I don't think there's a particular subject so much as there's a sense that I am trying to kind of find this transportive energy within sound by listening to the sort of this drone that I'm sort of building upon. So it's it's like a live sculpture in a way, is one way I think about it.
Yeah, cool. And how long have you been sort of exploring that ambient sort of sound?
Well, this is a great Minneapolis question.
Yeah.
Because I've played a lot of different kinds of music. I started out, I played classical piano. I was sort of trained to do that, and I kind of left that behind and played a lot of experimental music and lived in New York for a while, played rock music. I played with a West African singer, Janka Nabe from Sierra Leone, and worked with him for about 8 years. And so I worked in a lot of different genres, and I had not done anything like this. And I came to Minneapolis, and there was this festival called Drone Not Drones, which I had heard about. And people were playing drones all night, and they were interested in a certain experimental scene where you just worked with slow amounts of time and single tones, and it was collaborative, and it kind of had this chaotic spirit to it. And this was really exciting to me. It was something that influenced me when I moved here 10 years ago. And so it inspired me. I started a band called E, spelled I-E, back in 2016 with a group of friends, and that project has evolved. And that was influenced by drone and minimalism and ambient, although in a different way, because it's a full band. And then I think, it was sort of only a matter of time before I said I want to try to figure out what you could do in a solo space that would be different from working with other people.
Yeah.
And that's a kind of different thing where it's like, well, if I want to play this for a minute and a half and nothing else is going to happen, I can do that, and I can make those weird choices that are separate from improvised, a kind of group improvisation.
Yeah, so this is sort of like a spontaneous genre that you like fell into through like the Minneapolis local scene?
Yeah, it was something that the Twin Cities imprinted upon me.
Cool. Yeah, so do you have, like, now that you've sort of discovered this genre, have you found any other projects like influence you, or that it's more of like a spontaneous, either by yourself or through being in a space with other people?
It's there's keyboard nerd stuff.
Yeah.
There's like my friend Cooper Crane, who plays in a Bitch and Bajas, which is a band in Chicago, and they're do this sort of minimalist landscape stuff. He was a big influence on my playing. My friend Bobby, who plays in the band Oneida, these are like keyboard players who sort of opened up new ideas for me as a musician, and so that was something that kind of became a new path for me. I, so that's one influence. I think the scene itself. I think my friend Nate Nelson, who plays in this band American Cream, has a really anarchist collaborative spirit to his project. I think that was another influence. And then there are certain composers in the classical music tradition that I hadn't thought about in years and have started to come back. So a composer like Ligeti, composer like Xenakis, these composers who experimented a lot in the 60s with these really kind of nightmarish, impersonal landscapes of sound. And that music was exciting to me as a teenager. And I forgot about it. And then it suddenly came back in this weird spot, and I think another big influence would probably be Alice Coltrane's organ playing. She's someone who is a sort of master metaphysician of the keyboard, in terms of sort of divining things out of thin air. And her keyboard playing was an immense influence.
Yeah, and you talk about that metaphysics, or in other words, ineffability, and so I'm gonna segue that to your book that you just published, which is Refrains, Music Philosophy and the Ineffable. And so even just from hearing you talk about it, I can see that there's sort of that through line between your academic work and your like sonic work. But I would love if you would like elaborate on how those kind of work in conjunction for you.
Yeah, I'm also a scholar of music, and I think I wrote a lot about music and philosophy. And so the first time I wrote a book about music and philosophy, it was mostly about philosophers writing about music. And then, later on, it was like I sort of becoming, as a practicing musician, I started thinking about like, how do musicians themselves think philosophically about their own work? And listening to people like Ornette Coleman, I mentioned Alice Coltrane, bands like the Velvet Underground, Sun Ra, a lot of these musicians, particularly the 60s, and I know you're a fan of that period of time too, where all these musical genres were invented. This was a time when, people, I think were connecting new studio technologies with really interesting metaphysical ideas, and they're reading a lot of poetry and came up with sort of new visions about what music would be able to do. So I became interested in that as a scholar, like writing about the 1960s in particular. And I don't think I would have ever come up with this idea that musicians themselves kind of do philosophy had I not been spending so much time playing music and working with people like Janka, for instance, who provoked me with the way they understood music as being very, very different from how, I had been playing music in the past. And so their whole outlook really changed the way I saw music. And so I think that was a really transformative process for me to experience.
Yeah. And I know, playing with Janka, you got the opportunity to do like a ton of traveling and touring and all of that stuff. And you sort of touched on how that changed your perspective just in terms of playing music. But, I wonder, do you have any like highlights of places that you've played or moments that you kind of were like, oh man, like this is a wild experience for me to be able to use music as an opportunity to see different places, and also how working in that sphere sort of changed your perspective on the music industry as a whole?
Well, I think I toured a lot with Janka and with other projects too, but particularly with Janka. And one of the things that touring taught me was that the sacrifices one makes to play the music, to show up and to sort of risk things, right? To risk not having a normal job, right? Not being in a single place for, hanging out in, a group of friends, but instead like going on the road. And, these are real choices that can screw your life up in this kind of amazing way. And I think being on tour and going through the ritual of playing for all these different audiences in many, many, many different contexts, from clubs to art galleries to houses to performing arts centers to big festivals, you sort of you discover a whole different set of existential commitments to what music really is. Like, music is not just the sounds. Mm-hmm. It's not just making the sounds sound good. It's actually like living in these, challenging and intense spaces where you're putting it all on the line to try to make it work. And that was one of these philosophical lessons that, because it's existentialist in a way and it has to do with a certain kind of experience of life, it came through that practice. Mm. And then it was like slowing down. I was like, well, no philosopher has really engaged the intensity of what those risks are really about, mm-hmm. especially when it does derail your life, right? And like the music has that kind of depth to it.
Yeah.
And I think that opened up a lot of paths for me, both, in my thinking about music and in my playing, to understanding like if that's not happening, it's probably not worth doing. I was never the musician that was going to be able to work on a cruise ship and just, play a bunch of melodies and sort of entertain people or sit in a hotel bar. That was never my thing. I couldn't do this session gig type thing. I felt like I was someone who, if I was going to do it, it had to have that element of sacrifice behind it.
Mm-hmm. And so do you feel like now focusing on this more ambient and drone avenue, I don't want to say like negates that, but is just kind of removed from that like fast-paced lifestyle that touring has inherent in it?
Yeah, it's funny because there's a is the drone music itself a kind of slowing down? That's an interesting question. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Jonka's music was frenetic dance music. We would play at 1 a.m.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
And you're like trying to make the dance party work. Mm-hmm. And this is a very different kind of music, although it can be really late at night, right? Depending on the context. And I think, I think in a way, maybe drone music, is there something about Minnesota and the weather mm-hmm. and the long winters and the kind of, huddling together in the Cedar Cultural Center and, mm-hmm. and camping out and sort of having this meditative experience. Maybe the state is a sort of gives you a place to sort of slow down. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think one thing I've noticed if you go to Drone Not Drones and you sit there for hours and hours, it suddenly seems crazy that we would play music for only 30 minutes.
Yeah.
Like a 30-minute set. How could you possibly do that when it, if you sit there for 6 or 7 hours, it's like, oh, it's just music. Of course it has to be that slow. Mm-hmm. And the idea that your brain could be like spread out into that weird kind of space, I don't think I'd really experienced that until I moved here and had that.
Yeah. Lovely. That's so cool. And now I have like a fun question for you. If you were to be able to build a bill that has either, your solo project or E on it, and you get to pick, honestly, however many other artists you want to play with you, who would you pick?
Gosh.
It's a tough question.
It's totally putting
me... and the possibilities are endless.
I will say we were supposed to open for Damo Suzuki, the singer from Cannes.
I saw that.
And this was a show, and he sadly passed away. And it's a show that I think the Turf Club was going to do it. Mm-hmm. So they reached out to us, and then of course COVID hits. So we're like, well, it's probably not going to happen. Then, of course, it was canceled the first spring, and then he rescheduled. He's, no, I'm doing the tour, mm-hmm. and then it didn't end up happening. So this ended up being for E, a kind of fantasy show that has not quite, come together. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know that, maybe it's like the middle-aged person in me speaking. I think the community here. I mean, it's one of the most remarkable things about the Twin Cities is mm-hmm. having. I was living in New York and Chicago, and it's like, it's a less competitive scene in the Twin Cities, but the community is so much stronger for me, mm-hmm. right? I feel like the way in which, the kind of interchange among musicians and among bands and also among different generations and different scenes of music, it's a lot easier for that to happen in a city this size. And so in a way, I don't think I've been dreaming about amazing bills at big festivals or things like that.
Sure.
Because in part, I feel like lucky to be in a place where, that kind of social world exists. So, yeah, I mean, I know I'm copping out a little bit. of that
No,
question.
I'll take it. I'll take it. It emphasizes the importance of the local scene here, which is kind of what we're all about.
Yeah.
So, wrapping it up, if you have anything, shows coming up with E or your own stuff to promote, let everyone know what's going on.
Next Friday, my band E, spelled I-E, is going to play at a bike punk shop in Powderhorn. That's on the 7th of June, and I think that'll be outside. And then we're supposed to play at Mortimer's with Good Doom, which is some friends of ours. They're doing a record release, and I believe that's July 20th. You'll have to confirm that.
Okay, cool.
But those are the two shows that we have lined up. We're working on a new record. Our friend John Dietrich from Deerhoof is mixing it as we speak. In fact, he just sent me some mixes. So we've got a new record happening, and we're going to do some drone recordings too. And we've been writing new material, and that's been rewarding. So that's what's been happening.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here. As you've said and I've said, your name's Michael Gallope. This has been Off the Record on Radio K. Thanks so much for tuning in.
Thanks for having me.